I'm Lauren Bennett, 33 years old, and despite years of trying to build a life that felt like my own, my father never let me forget that I was the family's greatest disappointment. The night it all came to a head was glowing with fairy lights music drifting across the courtyard and the clink of champagne glasses echoing like glass bells. I stood near the long dining table trying to blend in with my siblings' polished laughter when my father lifted his glass, smiled at the guests, and said, "Let's just hope Lauren doesn't embarrass us tonight." Laughter rippled across the table. My mother looked down at her plate. I felt every heartbeat echo in my ears, but I didn't cry. I simply set down my fork, walked out past the garden hedges, and left. That was the moment I realized silence could be louder than any defense. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it. I grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, in a home where success had a dress code and affection came in measured doses. My father, Richard, built a real estate company from the ground up, and he liked to remind us that nothing mattered more than reputation. My mother, Elaine, moved through life like she was always hosting guests, careful, graceful, and never one to challenge him. My older brother, Ethan, followed the plan perfectly. Harvard Medical, a surgeon with a lake house and 2 flawless children. Caroline, my younger sister, was the legal prodigy, sharp-tongued and elegant, with a husband who collected golf memberships like trophies. And then there was me, the artist who never quite fit the frame. As a child, I rearranged furniture just to see how light changed a room. I painted the garage walls in my teens and once turned our backyard shed into a greenhouse for a science fair. My parents called it a phase. When I opened my own design studio years later, they called it a hobby. Every achievement I shared, a finished project, a small award, was met with a polite smile and a subject change. My father's pride was reserved for Ethan's surgeries and Caroline's promotions. My mother's praise came in whispers, always followed by a warning. "Don't take it personally, honey. Your father just doesn't understand creative work." I tried anyway. For years I decorated their homes, planned family events, offered to help wherever I could. When Caroline got engaged, I built the floral arch by hand. They called it quirky. When Ethan's son was born, I painted a watercolor for the nursery. He laughed and said they'd hire a real decorator. With every small dismissal, I shrank a little more. I wasn't angry then, just tired of being the strange one they tolerated at holidays. Every family gathering was a performance. Thanksgiving meant fine china and sharper words. My father would carve the roast and say, Caroline brought the wine, Ethan brought the prime rib, and Lauren brought feelings, I guess. Everyone chuckled, pretending it was harmless. At Christmas, when they bragged about bonuses and real estate, someone would ask me, "Still doing that fun little decorating thing?" I smiled every time because it was easier than fighting. But inside, I felt myself fade a little more into the wallpaper. The worst moment came 2 years before that party. For Mother's Day, I spent a week building a custom herb wall for her garden, something that would last. She glanced at it once and moved on. Caroline handed her a luxury handbag and the room erupted in applause. That was when I understood the unspoken rule in our family money was love's only language, and creativity was treated like noise. Still, I kept showing up, hoping someone would notice the effort beneath the quiet. By the time my parents' 40th anniversary came around, I was living in a small apartment downtown, running my design studio from a sunlit loft. I received the invitation with a note in my father's handwriting. Formal attire only. It wasn't a request. It was an order. I spent weeks debating whether to go. Against my better judgment, I designed a dress myself, dusky rose silk with a hand-stitched neckline, soft and understated. Maybe I thought this would be the night things were different. The venue was a rented country estate with manicured gardens and a jazz trio playing under strings of lights. Caroline organized the seating chart, of course. Ethan prepared a slideshow of family milestones. I sat near the end of the table trying to stay invisible until someone, probably my aunt, called out, "Let's hear from Lauren, the family artist." My fork hovered over my plate. I stood heart-thudding and began softly, "I just wanted to thank you for showing us that longevity and love," before my father cut in laughing. Maybe spare us the poetry this time, huh? The room chuckled. I smiled, sat down, and felt the air leave my lungs. Caroline leaned over and whispered, "You're too sensitive. That's just his way." But it wasn't just his way, it was a lifetime of small humiliations wrapped in politeness. In that moment, I saw every year I had tried to earn belonging, every apology I had made for being myself. The lamb on my plate had gone cold, and I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. I didn't need to stay where I was, constantly asked to disappear. I waited until the next song began, then stood up quietly without ceremony. I picked up my clutch, nodded once toward the table, and walked out through the garden, past the glowing topiaries and the vintage car parked for photos. No one followed me. I drove home with the windows down and the night air washing over me. For the first time in years, I wasn't leaving in shame. I was leaving in silence, and that silence, I would soon learn, could rebuild an entire life. When I left that night, I didn't expect anyone to notice. The road home was long and empty, lined with oaks that bowed low over the headlights. My dress pooled around me like rose-colored smoke, the hem catching on the car's pedals as I drove. I didn't cry, not then. I just replayed the laughter in my father's voice, the way the table had fallen silent, except for the sound of forks scraping china. Every mile that passed felt like shedding another layer of someone I had been trying to keep alive. The next morning I woke to sunlight stretching across the hardwood floor and the faint smell of coffee from the cafe below my apartment. The phone on my nightstand was dark. No missed calls, no messages, not even from my mother. It should have hurt, but instead it felt like confirmation. They had always been good at pretending distance was dignity, so I did what I always did. I went to work. My studio was a small space tucked above a florist's shop downtown. It smelled faintly of jasmine and sawdust, the scent of beginnings. I threw myself into projects, refinishing antique wood sketching layouts for local clients, rearranging rooms until light met texture just right. In design, everything made sense. Form followed feeling, and even the smallest details had purpose. But at home, my life had no such balance. The silence between my family and me stretched from days into weeks, then months. When the holidays came, I didn't receive an invitation. My mother sent a short text on Thanksgiving morning that read, "We're having dinner at 6. Hope you're doing well. No address, no warmth." I didn't respond. I roasted a small chicken for myself, opened a bottle of wine, and ate by candlelight. Outside, Charleston's cobblestone streets glowed with early winter rain. I thought about how my family was probably passing dishes and stories I was never part of. For once, the absence felt like peace. In the weeks that followed, I began noticing the quiet in new ways. I'd wake before sunrise, make coffee, and sit by the window sketching while the city still slept. Sometimes I caught my reflection in the glass and barely recognized her, the woman who no longer waited for approval. I took smaller design jobs in nearby towns, projects for families who cared more about comfort than prestige. They sent handwritten thank you cards, sometimes even photos of their finished spaces with smiling faces in them. Each note reminded me of what I'd been missing my whole life, appreciation that didn't require explanation. One afternoon, I received a message from Caroline. It read simply, "You've been quiet lately. Everyone's asking about you. No apology, no acknowledgement of the night I left." I stared at it for a long time before typing back, "I'm fine, just busy." Her reply came instantly, "You should come by sometime," but we both knew I wouldn't. The new year came and went. My father's company appeared in the local paper for another expansion deal, and my brother Ethan posted photos from a ski trip with his family. Caroline was featured in a legal magazine's top 30 under 30. Their lives looked glossy, untouched. Mine was quieter, slower, but real. I spent weekends exploring antique markets, collecting old glass jars and weathered blueprints that told stories of their own. One day in early spring, while sorting through design samples, I found an old envelope tucked into a stack of client forms. Inside was a family photo from years ago. My parents, my siblings, and me all dressed for Easter Sunday. I must have been 10. I was the only one looking away from the camera, distracted by something beyond the frame. I traced the outline of that little girl's face with my thumb and wondered when she'd stop trying to be seen. A few days later, I ran into an old neighbor, Mrs. Harris, outside the market. She smiled warmly. "Haven't seen your folks lately," she said. "Your father's still holding those big garden parties." I hesitated before nodding. "I wouldn't know," I replied softly. She studied me for a moment, then said, "You look peaceful, dear." "Keep that." It stayed with me the rest of the day. The idea that peace could be visible like light through clean glass. Work began to pick up that summer. A local cafe owner asked me to redesign their interior using reclaimed materials. I spent weeks sanding beams and sketching murals, losing myself in the process. When the project was done, they held a small opening night. The walls glowed with amber light, and people laughed softly over the sound of music. One of them introduced me to a guest from an architectural studio visiting from Oregon. She mentioned she'd seen photos of my designs online. Someone had shared them on a small blog. "You have a gift," she said. "We might have a project for you soon." I thanked her politely, not daring to hope. That night I walked home under the street lamps, my hands still smelling faintly of paint. I thought about how my father would have called it luck instead of skill, but for the first time it didn't matter. The world was beginning to notice me in ways my family never had. Then one afternoon in late August, I got an email with the subject line, "Design Collaboration Inquiry." It was from that Oregon studio. They were planning a wellness retreat, a space built around light movement and nature, and they wanted me to lead the interior concept. I read the message 3 times before it sank in. It wasn't just work. It was a chance to build something that carried meaning, something I could call entirely my own. The weeks that followed were a blur of plans and phone calls. I spent hours drafting designs, choosing materials, testing how sunlight would travel through each room. Every decision was deliberate, like breathing purpose, back into forgotten corners of my life. When the retreat finally opened 6 months later, it was covered by Archform magazine under the headline, "Nature Reimagined, a Living Space That Heals." My name was printed beneath it. Lauren Bennett, lead designer. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the page, tracing the letters with my fingertip. For years I'd waited for my family to introduce me with pride. Now the world was doing it for them, and they didn't even know. That night I opened my journal and wrote a single sentence. "You don't have to be invited to belong." It wasn't defiance, it was truth. I realized I'd been holding my breath my whole life, waiting for permission to exhale. When my first payment from the project arrived, I didn't rush to spend it. I took my time. I started searching through home listings, looking for something small but meaningful, a place that felt like a promise kept. One Sunday morning, I found it a 2-story glass house tucked between tall pines near the coast. It had wraparound windows, an open studio, and a garden that caught the morning fog. It wasn't perfect, but it felt alive. The day I signed the papers, I stood in the empty living room with the keys in my hand. The silence inside was steady like a heartbeat. I hung my favorite print above the fireplace. It read, "You are allowed to take up space." For the first time in my life, I believed it. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I made a quiet promise to myself. No more shrinking, no more waiting for applause from people who only knew how to clap for themselves. This house would be more than a place to live. It would be proof that I could build beauty without anyone's permission. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines like soft applause. I smiled and whispered into the stillness, "You're not an embarrassment. You're a beginning." The weeks after I moved into the glass house felt like stepping into someone else's life. Every morning began in stillness, coffee steaming on the counter, fog rolling through the pines, sunlight crawling across the floors like slow water. I filled my days with work, sketching and revising new projects from my small studio. At night I'd sit by the wide windows and listen to the wind brush the walls, feeling both free and unfamiliar. Silence had once felt like punishment. Now it felt like breath. It didn't take long for word of my retreat project to spread. Emails trickled in from architects and local publications. A few past clients sent kind notes, simple messages of pride or congratulations. I printed one and pinned it above my desk, a quiet reminder that recognition could exist without strings attached. But beneath all the noise of progress, there was a soft ache that hadn't gone away. Every victory seemed to echo in an empty room because the people I once hoped to share it with weren't there to hear it. By late spring, the house began to feel more like home. I spent evenings planting herbs along the patio and painting small studies on canvas, letting the rhythm of color and texture steady me. Natalie visited often, bringing bottles of wine and stories from the city. One night, as we sat outside watching the sky turn violet, she said, "You know, I think you finally built the life they told you wasn't possible." I smiled but didn't answer. There were parts of me still learning how to believe that. Then one morning a message appeared on my phone. It was from my mother. "Your father says we should check on you. Are you still in Charleston?" The wording made me laugh quietly, polite concern wrapped in distance. I typed a short reply. "I'm doing well, thank you," and left it at that. For a week, nothing else came. Then, on a quiet Sunday, Caroline called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Her voice carried the same careful brightness she always used when she wanted something. I saw the magazine feature she began. It looked nice. You've really made something of that design hobby. The word hobby stung, but I stayed calm. It's my work, Caroline. It's always been my work. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of her exhale catching. Dad said you should have told us. We could have helped with publicity or investors. I smiled to myself. That's kind, but I don't need that now. She hesitated before saying, "Mom misses you." It was a statement, not a confession. Then she ended the call. Afterward, I sat on the porch for a long time, watching the sun filter through the trees. I realized that conversation had given me more clarity than any argument ever could. Their version of love always came with conditions, visibility on their terms, pride that had to be earned twice over. Mine no longer did. Work continued to grow. By midsummer, I had 3 projects running at once: a cafe redesign, a coastal inn renovation, and a small exhibit for an art collective in Savannah. Each carried a piece of me, and for the first time, the recognition felt deserved. But with that success came attention I hadn't anticipated. One evening, Natalie forwarded me a social media post from an old family acquaintance. It was a photo of my magazine spread captioned, "Richard Bennett's daughter, following in his footsteps of excellence." I stared at it for a while, the irony settling in. For years, my father had downplayed everything I did, and now that others were noticing, he wanted a share of the reflection. The next morning he called. His voice was firm, almost rehearsed. "Lauren, your work's impressive. I've had several clients mention it. Maybe we should talk about future partnerships, show the Bennett name still stands for quality." I took a slow breath before answering. "Dad, this isn't your company. It's mine." Silence stretched on the line. Then he said, "Everything you know about design came from growing up in our home." His tone softened, but not from affection. "Don't forget who gave you your start." I ended the call before I could reply. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. I walked through the house, touching the surfaces I had chosen, the furniture I had built, the walls I had painted myself. Every piece of it was mine, and yet the echo of his claim still lingered. Later that night, Natalie came by unannounced, holding a carton of takeout and her camera slung over her shoulder. "You look like you've been arguing with ghosts," she said lightly. I smiled, half-tired. "Just one ghost, actually." She stayed until the stars came out, taking photos of the house by candlelight. Before she left, she looked around and said, "You realize you don't need their applause anymore, right? The world's already clapping." I nodded, but deep down I knew that applause didn't erase the years of being unseen. Healing wasn't instant. It was slow, quiet, and sometimes lonely. A few weeks later, I received a formal invitation in the mail. Heavy paper gold trim, Bennett Family Charity Gala. Underneath a note in my mother's handwriting, "It would mean a lot to your father if you attended." I turned it over in my hands. The event was at the same estate where I'd last seen them, the same place I'd walked out of a year earlier. For a moment, I thought about going about showing up not as the family's embarrassment, but as someone who had built a life on her own terms. Then I set the card down on the counter and left it there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Memories of past gatherings kept playing like flickers of an old film. The forced smiles, the half-whispered jokes, the way I'd once measured my worth by their reactions. I got up, pulled on a sweater, and went out to the patio. The garden lights swayed gently in the wind. Somewhere beyond the trees, a nightbird called. I thought of how many times I'd traded my voice for belonging, how many times I'd accepted being the punchline just to stay in the frame. In that moment, I understood what leaving had really meant. It wasn't just walking away from a party or a house. It was stepping out of a version of myself that existed only for their comfort. I whispered into the night, "I'm done being edited." A few days later, the magazine that had featured my retreat project contacted me again. They wanted to include me in a follow-up piece, an article about women redefining creative success. It felt like the right time. During the interview, the editor asked what inspired my work. I hesitated, thinking of my family, of all the years I'd tried to prove I belonged. Then I said I build spaces that remind people they're allowed to exist exactly as they are. When the article came out, the photo showed me standing barefoot in my studio light, spilling through the skylight. My mother texted that afternoon. We saw the feature. "You look beautiful. Your father says congratulations." It was the first kind thing she'd said to me in years, yet it read like a press release. I typed back, "Thank you," and left it there. Autumn came quietly. The days grew shorter, the air cooler. Work slowed just enough for me to notice how peaceful my life had become. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since college. One night I wrote, "Maybe being invisible was the price of learning how to see myself." Still, I couldn't ignore the small tug inside me, the one that wondered how long silence could last before it turned into another kind of wall. Part of me knew something was coming, something that would force our worlds to collide again. And when it did, I wanted to be ready not for their approval, but for my own truth. Autumn faded into winter before I realized how long it had been since I'd seen my family in person. Their absence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a clearing after a storm. My house stood quietly among the trees, each day unfolding in its own rhythm. I woke early, worked late, and filled the spaces in between with walks along the coast. The salt air softened something inside me, something that used to be tight with expectation. I had stopped chasing approval, and in that stillness, something new began to grow. The second article about my work was published just before Christmas. Hearth and Form featured a full spread on women in design builders of spaces that healed. My photograph appeared beside a quote that read, "Design is not about status, it's about belonging." The editor, Evelyn Marsh, called to congratulate me. Her voice carried that warm steadiness of someone who had fought her own quiet battles in the industry. "Your story resonated with a lot of readers," she said. "You built something honest. That's rare." I thanked her, though it took me a moment to absorb the words. The magazine piece brought a small surge of recognition. My inbox filled with invitations to speak at design events, to collaborate, to share my process. I said yes to a few and turned down many. I didn't want noise, I wanted meaning. In those months, my projects grew more personal. A home for a single mother, starting over a reading room for a public library, a healing space for trauma survivors. Each one felt like a quiet act of defiance against the world I had come from, a world that measured worth by square footage and pedigree. One evening after finishing a long day at the studio, I walked into my kitchen to find an envelope on the counter. Natalie had dropped it off earlier. Inside was a note in my mother's familiar handwriting, "Your father's birthday dinner next Saturday. We'd like you to come. It's been too long." There was no apology, no mention of the years of silence, just that clipped tone of expectation, as if nothing had happened. I turned the card over in my hands, then set it beside the sink. For the rest of the night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The following week, I mentioned it to Natalie over coffee. She looked at me for a long moment before saying, "You don't owe them anything, Lauren, but maybe you owe yourself the chance to see it clearly on your own terms." I didn't answer, but I knew she was right. Avoiding them forever would mean carrying their voices in my head anyway. Facing them might finally quiet them. So on Saturday, I drove to my parents' home for the first time in nearly 2 years. The house looked smaller than I remembered grand, but tired the kind of beauty that hid cracks behind fresh paint. When I stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of cologne and lemon polish. My mother appeared first elegant as ever, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Lauren," she said softly, touching my arm, "it's so good to see you." I nodded, unsure whether to hug her or stand still. My father came in moments later, his voice booming from the dining room. "Look who decided to show up." He grinned, but there was an edge beneath it. Ethan and Caroline were already seated, their children running through the hall with the kind of ease that came from being welcome. For a moment, I felt 12 years old again, unsure where to stand, how to fit. Dinner began politely enough. Conversation moved from my brother's new research project to my sister's firm acquiring a major client. When my mother asked about my design work, my father cut in before I could answer. "We've seen her articles," he said, setting down his glass. "You've done well, Lauren, though it's odd you didn't mention your family name. A missed opportunity, if you ask me." Caroline smiled tightly. "Dad's just proud," she said quickly, trying to soften the moment. But the words had already landed. I could have argued. Instead, I breathed and kept my tone calm. The work speaks for itself. It doesn't need a last name attached. My father chuckled under his breath. Still the dramatic one. The room went quiet. I folded my napkins, slowly aware of every eye on me. Maybe I said softly, but at least I'm finally telling my own story. For the rest of the meal, conversation circled safely around other topics. My mother filled plates, my siblings talked over each other, and I let the noise wash over me. It was strange being there, familiar, yet foreign. The house that once held so much pressure now felt like a museum of old habits. Every photo on the wall was curated perfection. Not one showed a moment out of place. After dessert, I stood to leave. My father glanced up. "Already?" he asked. "You just got here." I smiled faintly. "Yes, but I've got a long drive back." He nodded once, dismissive, and turned to refill his glass. My mother walked me to the door. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for mine. "He doesn't mean to hurt you," she whispered. "It's just his way." I looked at her, the woman who had spent a lifetime keeping peace that never existed. "I know," I said quietly. "That's why I'm leaving early." Driving home, I rolled down the windows, letting the cold night air fill the car. The stars were sharp above the treetops, the sky deep and clear. For the first time, I didn't feel the familiar ache of rejection. I felt distance and relief. That dinner had shown me what I needed to see: the house would always be a stage, and I no longer belonged to its script. In the days that followed, I poured my focus back into my work. Evelyn called again to invite me to a design conference in Vancouver. "We'd love for you to speak about your process," she said, "your perspective on independence, how it shapes your spaces." The idea made me nervous, but I agreed. It felt like a step forward, a chance to voice the story I had lived quietly for so long. Preparing for the trip, I found myself thinking less about my family and more about what I wanted to build next. The success, the recognition, it mattered less than the meaning behind it. Every project I accepted now had a heartbeat, a sense of purpose that went deeper than profit. On the morning of the conference, I stood before the mirror in my hotel room, adjusting the lapel of my blazer. My reflection stared back, steady and unafraid. When I walked onto the stage later that day, the lights were soft and the audience silent. I told them about building spaces that allowed people to breathe, about the courage it takes to create without permission. When the applause came, it wasn't thunderous, but it was warm, genuine, and enough. That evening, I sat by the hotel window overlooking the city lights and realized something simple yet profound. Leaving wasn't an escape, it was an awakening. The version of me that had always waited to be chosen was gone. I had chosen myself instead. Outside, rain began to fall, soft and rhythmic against the glass. I thought of my home by the coast, the garden lights swaying gently in the wind. I couldn't wait to return, not to hide, but to begin again on my own terms. When I returned from the Vancouver conference, the world felt wider. My talk had gone better than I expected, and for the first time I had spoken about my work without apologizing for how I came to it. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was honest. People came up afterward sharing stories about spaces that had healed them, about starting over. It made me realize something simple: belonging didn't come from being invited. It came from creating a place where you could finally exhale. Back home, I walked through my quiet house and felt an ache to fill it, not with noise, but with life. For years, every family gathering had been about image, about presentation. I wanted something different. I wanted warmth. So I decided to host a dinner, not a party, not an event, just a gathering, the kind that reminded people what it felt like to be seen. I spent the next few weeks planning it in the way only a designer could, every detail intentional but unpretentious. The invitations were handwritten on soft cream cardstock sealed with gold wax. Each one said only, "Let's celebrate what we build for ourselves." I mailed them to 35 people who had shaped my new life friends from design school, former clients who had become confidants, and 2 mentors who had quietly believed in me long before recognition arrived. When the evening came, the house glowed under a sky streaked with rose and gold. I'd strung lights through the pines and set a long oak table in the garden, draped in linen the color of riverstone. Soft music played in the background, a mix of acoustic jazz and old Norah Jones tracks Natalie loved. The air smelled faintly of cedar and rosemary from the candles scattered along the path. Guests began to arrive just before sunset. Each face carried warmth, a kind of familiarity that came not from blood, but from kindness. They stepped into the garden and paused, taking in the view, the glass walls catching the last light, the scent of herbs drifting on the breeze. Lauren, one of them, said, "This feels like a sanctuary." I smiled, because that was exactly what I had wanted it to be. Dinner unfolded slowly. Laughter moved easily across the table, carried by the rhythm of shared stories. I watched people who had once been strangers to each other connect over food and conversation, their voices soft but alive. It was nothing like the polished performances my parents used to host. There were no photo ops, no speeches, no hierarchy, just connection. At one point, Natalie leaned over and whispered, "This is what home is supposed to feel like." Later, as the evening deepened, someone proposed a toast. "To building lives we don't have to escape from," said one of my mentors, raising her glass. The words settled into me like roots taking hold. I looked around at the faces glowing in the candlelight and realized that, without meaning to, I had created a family, one made of choice, not obligation. A photographer friend snapped a candid picture of me near the end of the night, standing barefoot by the garden steps, string lights tangled softly above me. I was laughing, head tilted slightly back, a glass of wine in hand. She posted it the next morning with a caption that read, "She didn't change, she just came home to herself." The image spread farther than I expected. Friends shared it, tagging me with messages of encouragement and pride. Even people I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, old classmates, former coworkers, acquaintances, who said the photo made them feel hopeful. Buried among those comments were 4 names that made me pause: Caroline, Ethan, Mom, and Dad. At first, it was just a trickle. My mother's message came first. "The house looks beautiful. You should have told us." Caroline followed. "You really hosted something like that and didn't think we'd want to come." Then Ethan posted an old photo of all of us as kids with a caption that read, "Some people forget where they came from." And finally, my father, always the one to turn sentiment into accusation, sent a short text beneath a screenshot of the garden photo. "So, this is who you are now." I stared at the messages for a long time. There was no apology hidden in their words, only surprise that I had built something beyond their reach. I didn't reply, not because I was angry, but because there was nothing left to explain. The people who had never asked how I was suddenly wanted to claim the part of me that had flourished without them. Within days, I began noticing their reactions online. My sister posted a photo of a Bennett family dinner with the caption, "Some things money can't buy: real love, real connection." My mother commented with hearts, and my father added, "Family always comes first." The irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew the truth. Natalie sent me a screenshot with one word: performative. The difference between them and me was no longer painful, it was clear. They cared more about the story they told the world than the silence they kept with me. I refused to feed it. Instead, I spent the next weekend quietly cleaning up after the gathering, tucking candles back into drawers, pressing linens, sweeping rose petals from the path. There was peace in those small rituals. A week later, my father's email arrived. The subject line read simply, "Your choices." His words were cold and measured like a memo from his office. "You embarrassed this family. You made it look like we didn't love you. Maybe next time think before putting on a show." I read it twice, then folded my laptop shut. It no longer hurt. What once would have broken me now just confirmed what I already knew. My silence had power they couldn't control. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of rain. I poured a glass of wine, lit a candle, and sat by the window. The house was still, but not lonely. I opened my phone and typed a single sentence on a black background. "Silence isn't distance. Sometimes it's healing." I posted it to my story without thinking. Within minutes, messages poured in, friends, clients, even strangers writing "thank you." I needed this. My family saw it too, of course. They didn't respond. That night, the moon hung low over the water, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small under it. I felt rooted. I had finally done something brave, not by confronting them, but by no longer needing to. The girl who once waited for their approval had learned to stop performing. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Caroline. "Coffee. Just us. No performance." I stared at the words, unsure if I should answer. Then I typed back, "Neutral place. No expectations." As I hit send, I didn't feel dread or anger, just curiosity. Maybe this was the start of something different. Maybe not. Either way, I was ready to walk into whatever came next with my eyes open and my voice steady. The morning after Caroline's text, I woke early to the sound of rain tapping the windows. The air was soft and gray, the kind that makes you pause before moving. I read her message again. "Coffee, just us. No performance," and let the words settle. There had been so many false starts before, so many moments that felt like apology but weren't. Still, something about the tone felt different. I typed back, "Sure. Tomorrow 11, the cafe by the bookstore." The next day, the world smelled like wet earth and new beginnings. I arrived a few minutes early, choosing a small corner table by the window. The cafe was quiet, except for the soft hum of the espresso machine and the murmur of rain outside. Caroline walked in right on time, her posture perfect as always, but her expression was cautious, less armor, more uncertainty. She wore a simple gray coat instead of her usual tailored blazer. "Hey," she said, her voice small against the clatter of cups. I smiled slightly. "Hey." For a moment, we just looked at each other. Then she exhaled long and slow. "I know this is overdue." I nodded, waiting. She stirred her coffee, staring into the swirl of foam before continuing. "That post of yours, the one with the lights in your garden, it caught me off guard, I guess. I didn't realize how far apart we'd grown until I saw it." I didn't interrupt. The old me would have rushed to fill the silence to make her comfortable. "Not this time." She glanced up. "I know we've been awful. I won't defend it. But seeing you there happy and not needing us, it felt like a slap." I raised an eyebrow. "A slap?" She winced. "I mean, not that you did anything wrong. It's just we were excluded. And maybe for the first time we saw what it felt like." I took a slow sip of tea before answering. "Caroline, I was excluded my whole life. From conversations, from respect, from mattering. I spent years trying to earn a place that was never going to be given." Her eyes dropped. "That night wasn't about revenge," I continued quietly. "It was about finally celebrating myself without apology." She nodded slowly. "I get that now, or I'm trying to." The rain softened outside, a rhythm against the glass. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then she said, "You always scared us, you know. You never followed the plan. You didn't fit the Bennett blueprint." I smiled faintly. "You mean I didn't follow the family formula?" That drew a small laugh from her. "Something like that," she said. Her voice softened. "What would it take for us to try again?" I thought carefully before speaking. "You don't get to rewrite me," I said evenly. "No more jokes disguised as love. No more apologies wrapped in excuses. If you want to be in my life, you come in as an equal, not as my judge." Caroline blinked, her eyes glossy. "Okay," she whispered. "That's fair." She didn't ask to see the house. She didn't ask for photos or introductions. Just one question. "Can I try to do better?" I looked at her, really looked and said, "You can try." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was real. And for the first time in years, I felt seen without having to shrink. We parted with a quiet hug, awkward, hesitant, but genuine. As I stepped out into the drizzle, I realized I wasn't walking away from her anymore. I was walking towards something new, something that might one day resemble understanding. A week later, an email arrived from Evelyn. The subject line read Feature Inquiry. She wrote, "We're planning a special edition on women who build differently. Would you be open to a full feature?" My fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I remembered all the times I'd been told to be humble, to make myself smaller so others wouldn't feel threatened. I typed back one word: yes. The interview took place in my studio. The photographer, a quiet woman named Helen, moved carefully around the space as sunlight streamed through the skylight. Evelyn sat across from me, recorder in hand, asking questions that felt more like conversation than interrogation. "What inspires your work?" she asked. I thought for a moment. "Spaces have memory," I said. "They hold every version of who we've been. I design for people who were once told they were too much or not enough, people who need a place that lets them breathe again." When the article came out a month later, it exceeded anything I imagined. The feature ran under the headline, "Lauren Bennett Building Beauty Without Permission." The photograph showed me barefoot in the studio, paint smudges on my hands, morning light spilling across the floor. Beneath it, a caption read, "Sometimes the places we leave shape us just as much as the ones we build." The piece spread quickly online in design circles across social media. Former professors sent messages of pride. A woman I'd met years ago at a networking event wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to walk away from people who never clapped for me." I didn't realize how much I needed to hear that until I did. My family saw the article too. This time, there were no sarcastic posts, no passive-aggressive remarks, just silence. For once, it wasn't painful. It was peaceful. The control they'd held over my narrative had slipped quietly out of their hands. That weekend, I hosted a small dinner at my home. Not a grand event, just the people who had become my chosen family: Natalie, a few friends, and Caroline. She arrived with a simple bouquet of wildflowers and a bottle of wine. There were no cameras, no expectations, just laughter, soft enough to feel like a promise. After dinner, as we cleared the table, Caroline lingered near my bookshelf, running her fingers along the spines. "You know," she said, "I think this is the first time I've seen you without armor." I smiled. "That's because it's the first time I've felt safe without it." She looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "I hope you know I'm proud of you." Her voice cracked slightly, and I could tell it wasn't rehearsed. When the last guest left and the house grew still again, I stepped outside. The garden lights swayed gently in the evening wind. I stood barefoot on the damp grass, the air cool against my skin. For the first time in years, I wasn't reaching for peace, it was already here. I thought about the long road that had led to this moment, the silence, the distance, the rebuilding. It had all been leading to this, standing in the space I'd made for myself, knowing I no longer had to fight for a seat at anyone else's table. The next morning, I found a message from Evelyn in my inbox. "Beautiful work, Lauren. The world needs more voices like yours." I read it twice, smiling to myself. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, pouring gold across the garden. I brewed coffee, opened the windows, and whispered to the quiet air, "Here's to starting again." The days after the magazine feature felt strangely calm. It was as if the storm that had once circled my name had finally passed, leaving quiet sunlight in its place. Work filled my schedule, but not in the frantic way it used to. Each project felt deliberate, each design an act of gratitude for the peace I'd fought for. When clients came to see the studio, they didn't just compliment the work, they asked about the story behind it. Somehow, that meant more than the praise itself. Then one afternoon, while reviewing plans for a renovation project, I received an email from Hearth and Form's editorial office. Evelyn had forwarded a message that made my hands still over the keyboard. It was from my father. "We're proud of Lauren's accomplishments. Thank you for representing the Bennett name so well." I read it twice before realizing it wasn't directed to me, it was sent to the magazine. My name, my work, once a point of shame, was now being used to decorate the family's image. For a long moment I sat in silence, the hum of the air vent the only sound in the room. Then slowly I began to type a reply, calm, measured, professional. Thank you, Evelyn. Please note that my professional identity is Lauren Bennett, independent designer. I'd appreciate that any future references remain personal, not familial. I clicked send and felt a quiet weight lift. The message wasn't for him. It was for me to draw the line that should have been there all along. That evening, Natalie stopped by for dinner. I told her about the email and she just shook her head. They'll always want to rewrite your story, she said softly, but they can't not anymore. We ate by the window while dusk settled outside, the garden lights flickering on one by one. I thought about how much energy I used to spend explaining myself, defending my choices. Now the only proof I needed was the peace that filled my home. A few weeks later, Caroline invited me to her office for lunch. She looked different, somehow less polished, more human. Over sandwiches and tea, she said quietly, "Dad's been talking about you a lot lately. He's not sure how to reach out." I smiled faintly. "He doesn't need to." She nodded but didn't argue. "I know, but I think he's realizing that the distance isn't power anymore. It's just lonely." I didn't know how to respond. The truth was, I'd stopped wishing for reconciliation. Some things once broken were meant to stay that way, not out of spite, but for self-preservation. Caroline seemed to understand. She changed the subject, asking about my projects, genuinely curious this time. As she listened, I caught a glimpse of something I'd never seen in her before, a quiet respect. 2 months later, Hearth and Form invited me to an awards dinner in New York. My feature had been nominated for Design Story of the Year. I almost declined, but Natalie insisted. "You have to go," she said. "This isn't just a career moment, it's a life moment." So I packed a dress, booked a flight, and told myself to accept the honor without apology. The ballroom shimmered under chandeliers, filled with people I'd admired for years. When my name was called, the applause felt distant at first, like it was echoing from another lifetime. I walked to the stage, steady, calm, and when I reached the microphone, I spoke from the place that had once been quiet. "We build spaces to feel safe," I said. "But sometimes the hardest part is realizing we're allowed to build them for ourselves." When I returned to my table, Evelyn smiled warmly. "You know," she said, "that line will stay with people." I thanked her and meant it. Later that night, as the evening wound down, my phone buzzed with messages. Most were from colleagues, but one stopped me cold. It was from my father. "Congratulations, you've made us proud." Your mother cried, watching the live stream. For a long time I just stared at the words. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the years between us, but for the first time there was no mockery either. Just simple pride, late but real. I typed a brief reply. "Thank you. I hope you're both well." Then I put the phone away. That was enough. When I landed back in Charleston the next afternoon, Natalie was waiting at the gate with a bouquet of white tulips. "You did it," she said, wrapping me in a hug. "You built a life that doesn't depend on their approval." I laughed softly. "It feels strange, doesn't it?" Winning quietly. She smiled. "That's the best kind." A few days later, Caroline stopped by unannounced, carrying a framed copy of the magazine's award article. "I thought you should have this," she said. I invited her in, and for the first time she moved through my home without hesitation, running her fingers along the shelves, admiring the small details. "You really did all this yourself," she whispered. "Every inch," I replied. She looked around again, then turned to me. "Dad wanted me to ask if he could visit sometime, just to see it." I didn't answer right away. The question hung between us like smoke. Finally I said, "Maybe someday, but not yet." She nodded, understanding. "He's starting to realize he can't demand access anymore. You taught him that." That night after she left, I stood by the window watching the rain streak across the glass. The world outside was quiet, the garden lights glowing softly through the mist. It struck me that justice doesn't always arrive in loud declarations or courtroom scenes. Sometimes it's the silence that follows, the kind that says, "I'm finally free." A week later, Evelyn called with news that the article had been picked up for an international feature. "You'll be in architectural review this fall," she said, her tone bright. "They're focusing on designers who changed the conversation." I thanked her, smiling to myself. Somewhere deep down, I felt the old ache stir, wishing my family could have understood me sooner. But then I realized something else. If they had, I might never have built this version of my life. That evening, Caroline texted a photo of our father sitting by the fireplace reading the Hearth and Form article. Beneath it, she wrote, "He keeps it in his office now." I didn't know whether to cry or laugh, so I did neither. I just set the phone down and let the moment be what it was. A quiet kind of justice, the kind that doesn't need witnesses. Outside, the sky deepened to blue, and I walked out into the garden barefoot, the earth cool beneath my feet. The lights above swayed gently, reflecting off the windows of the home I had built from the ground up. This place had become more than shelter. It was proof. The girl who once walked out of her parents' dinner in silence had finally found her own voice. And the silence that followed her no longer hurt, it healed. The following spring arrived softly with warm rain and the faint scent of magnolia drifting through my open windows. The world outside my home seemed to move faster than ever, projects, interviews, invitations, but inside everything had slowed to a gentle rhythm I could finally keep up with. I woke early each morning, brewed coffee, and sat by the wide glass wall, watching the fog lift off the garden. Every sunrise felt like a quiet thank you, whispered back to the life I'd fought to build. Caroline visited often now. She never arrived with announcements or agendas, just a knock, a smile, and time. We'd sit on the porch and talk about small things, her clients, my designs, the new bakery that opened near her office. Sometimes she'd glance around the house and say, "You really did make this place a home." I'd nod, knowing she meant more than the walls around us. It took months, but one afternoon she mentioned our parents. "Dad's been reading that article again," she said gently. "He doesn't say much, but I think he's proud in his own way." I smiled faintly. Maybe pride isn't what I need from him anymore. She understood. There was no need to fill the silence with promises. A few weeks later, I hosted a small dinner, just close friends, a few mentors, Natalie and Caroline. The air was warm, the garden strung with soft lights that swayed with the breeze. We cooked together, laughing as we went, music drifting from the open windows. At one point, as we sat around the long wooden table, Natalie raised her glass. "To building the life you deserve," she said. I looked at the faces around me, people who had chosen me without condition, and felt a kind of fullness that didn't need words. Halfway through dessert, Caroline stood and slipped something into my hand. It was a small envelope. Inside was a letter, written in my father's careful handwriting. "Lauren," it began, "I'm not good at apologies. I've spent my life mistaking control for love. Seeing your name in print, hearing others speak your name with respect, it forced me to face things I should have seen long ago. I hope in time you'll believe that I am proud, even if I showed it too late." I folded the letter slowly, letting the words sink in. There were no grand gestures, no phone calls, no requests for forgiveness, just acknowledgement, and that was enough. I didn't say much to Caroline, only whispered, "Thank you for bringing this." She smiled, eyes shining. "He wrote it himself. That's new." Later that night, after everyone had gone home, I stepped outside barefoot, the grass cool beneath my feet. The garden lights shimmered like small constellations. I thought about how far I'd come since that night at my parents' anniversary dinner, the humiliation, the quiet exit, the years of silence that followed. Every part of it had led here to this house, this peace, this version of myself that no longer needed to prove anything. I looked toward the table still set under the canopy and realized something simple but powerful. I hadn't burned the bridges behind me. I had simply built a better home on the other side, one where laughter wasn't conditional, where love didn't require shrinking, where belonging wasn't something you begged for, it was something you made with your own hands. Inside, the house glowed softly, the scent of candle wax and herbs lingering in the air. I poured a glass of wine, sat by the window, and let the quiet settle around me. My father's letter rested on the table beside me. Not forgiveness, not closure, but proof that even the hardest hearts can change when faced with truth they can't rewrite. As the clock ticked past midnight, I caught my reflection in the glass. The woman staring back looked steady, unguarded, whole. I finally understood that justice doesn't always come with noise or confrontation. Sometimes it comes in stillness, in the choice to live well without needing an audience. So I raised my glass not to victory, but to peace, and whispered into the dark, "You did it. You built a life that feels like yours." Before I go, I want to thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever walked away from something that broke you, or rebuilt yourself after being told you couldn't, this one was for you. Take a deep breath, share your strength with someone who needs it, and remember sometimes the quietest justice is simply living free. And if this story spoke to you, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Take a moment to subscribe or leave a comment sharing what peace means to you. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep building the life you deserve.